Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Emma Gillespie.
I'm Billi FitzSimons.
This week marks 40 years since a major milestone in Aboriginal land rights history. In October 1985, the federal government returned the title deeds of Uluru-Kata Tjuta National Park to the traditional custodians of the region, the Anangu people. 4 decades on, celebrations began in London last week, where King Charles met with First Nations leaders ahead of more anniversary plans on country this week. Today, we are going to take you through what led to the 1985 handback, its significance, and where First Nations issues stand 4 decades on.
Uluru is an iconic landmark. It attracts thousands, maybe millions, I'm not sure, but thousands of visitors definitely every single year to Australia. To kind of set the scene here, do you want to tell us about the cultural significance of Uluru?
Yeah, absolutely. So Uluru, or Uluru-Kata Tjuta National Park, is this massive, massive site in Australia's Red Centre. It covers 1,300 square kilometres, and within that park are 2 geological rock formations. 2 very large rock formations, I should say. Uluru, which is 348 metres high, and Kata Tjuta, which is a group of 36 domes with the highest formations rising to around 500 metres. So these really remarkable natural formations. And these are sacred sites to the traditional owners, the Anangu people, who have lived in the area for more than 30,000 years. Now, 2 years after it was returned to the First Peoples of the area, the handback we're discussing today, the park was added to the UNESCO World Heritage List in 1987. And that's significant because it basically guarantees the protection of this site as a significant natural and cultural area.
And what do we know about Uluru prior to it being returned to the traditional owners?
The land was taken over by the South Australian government in 1873, and in 1958 the area was declared a national park by the Commonwealth, and that was a declaration that happened without consultation with the traditional owners. Uluru the Rock, though, was called Uluru long before colonisation, but in 1873, an explorer by the name of William Goss renamed it Ayers Rock. That was after the former South Australian Premier Sir Henry Ayres, and for the better part of a century, Ayers Rock was the most widely used name for this sacred site. I'm sure a lot of people have heard it referred to Ayers Rock. But in 1993, it was officially renamed Ayers Rock / Uluru. It was the first NT landmark to actually be given dual names. Little interesting bit of trivia there. And then in 2002, these names were reversed and the rock took on the official name of Uluru / Ayers Rock, which it still has today. But more and more over recent years, Ayers Rock really feels like a name that has been a lot more phased out. Uluru is, I'd say, the most prominent name that we call it these days. And if you ever visit the area, all the traditional owners, of course, will call it Uluru as well.
So its name was returned to Uluru after it went through this handback process. I want to go back to the handback process because that's what the anniversary this week is. Do you want to tell us more about what led to that handback?
Yeah, so this was a culmination of years and years of advocacy by traditional owners who were fighting to regain ownership of this sacred area, their sacred lands. So it was a long campaign, but a key moment came in 1979. That's when the Anangu people presented a claim to the Aboriginal Land Rights Commission. Then we had 6 years of extensive hearings, investigations, and eventually a High Court judge, a justice by the name of Leslie Toohey, ruled in favour of the traditional owners and recommended the land be returned to them. That recommendation was accepted by the federal government, and after negotiations, a formal handback ceremony happened on the 26th of October 1985, and that was when the Governor-General at the time returned the title deeds for Uluru-Kata Tjuta to the traditional custodians of the area.
So by no means was it an easy process. The government did try to fight the traditional owners through this.
There was, I suppose, controversy around the process. 1985 might not sound so long ago, but in terms of the discussion about Aboriginal rights, it was certainly divisive in some parts of the country for a time.
And the site now, like I said before, it's such a popular tourist destination for so many people, you know, Australians as well as people coming from overseas. How does that work the tourism side of it.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting part of the story. So during the same ceremony where ownership was returned to the traditional owners, they actually signed a joint management agreement to lease the park back to the Australian National Parks and Wildlife Service. So the traditional owners agreed with this government agency that they would work in partnership together to care for and manage the park. And that includes, managing the tourism trade in the area and maintaining culturally sensitive practices for people who do visit that sacred site.
And what does that agreement look like now in, I guess, practical terms?
Yeah, so obviously there is this symbolic significance when we're talking about the title deeds being returned to the First Nations people of the area. But this also really gave the Anangu people legal ownership and a genuine say in how their sacred lands are managed. So, for example, under this joint management model, the traditional custodians have input into all major decisions about the park. They're employed as rangers, they conduct cultural tours, and they've really been able to implement important changes that respect their cultural values so that, the rest of the country and the world can continue to enjoy that site alongside them.
And we're talking about it today because it is the 40-year anniversary this week. I don't think it's exactly today, but it is this week.
Yep.
How is it being commemorated?
Hi, I'm Zara. I'm the co-founder of the Daily Aus, and we started this company because we think news can be done differently. If you agree, you can hit subscribe. It's the best way to help us grow. Now, back to the video.
So celebrations started early, you're correct. The anniversary officially is the 26th, but last week there was a service in London that was attended by King Charles. That was held at Australia House, and a group of 9 traditional owners from the Red Centre were there to speak with the King.
Just to clarify, Australia House in London.
Australia House in London. This is the High Commission, yes. Australia's High Commission in the UK. And there was one Anangu woman, Alison Carroll, who was among the leaders that spoke, and she reflected on the significance of the King's presence at this event, and her words were translated by a fellow Anangu representative, Harry Wilson. But basically, she described the handback process as one that gives the First Peoples of the area a sense of belonging, ownership, and control. She reflected on growing up, seeing monarchs like the Queen, and how times have shifted for her people. The 9 representatives who were there speaking to the King, they'll make their way back to Australia now, and there'll be on-country celebrations later in the week. That includes a public celebration concert on Saturday, which will feature traditional dance, live performances, and the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, is expected to attend some of those celebrations.
I was going to ask, has the federal government said much about this yet?
Yeah, so during that service with King Charles in London, there was a video message played from Anthony Albanese, and the Prime Minister called the 1985 handback a milestone in Aboriginal land rights in Australia. He called it a powerful moment in the story of our continent. He also thanked the traditional owners who made the long journey to share their cultural history in the UK, as well as the King for, quote, taking this opportunity to meet with traditional owners ahead of what is a deeply significant anniversary. He added, in Australia, Uluru stands as a monument to our people's love for the country and their determination to seek justice done.
One thing that I remember became a huge moment in recent memory when it comes to Uluru is the ban on people walking over it. Do you remember that?
Yes.
I think it was 2019.
It was 2019, Billy. Great memory.
What can you tell us about that?
So this is a direct outcome of the 1985 handback, a really significant outcome at that. So yeah, in 2019, we saw that change after decades of tourists climbing the rock, despite it being a sacred First Nations site. And essentially, after the traditional owners regained ownership, they really pushed for and were finally able to close that climb. Years of requests for that to happen. And I also think it's interesting to reflect on the legacy of 40 years since this agreement, which has also been replicated in other national parks across Australia. So it's influenced quite broadly how we think about land rights and First Nations participation in land management and how the government interacts with traditional owners in those situations.
And just before we go, it is October. It was 2 years ago when the Voice referendum was, and that failed. How have First Nations issues changed and developed in the decades since the handback?
Yeah, I think it would be remiss of us not to describe the decades since as a really mixed picture. As you mentioned, it was the 2-year anniversary just a few days ago on the 14th of October of the failed voice referendum. So that was the day in 2023 when Australia rejected that proposal to recognise First Nations peoples in the Constitution, to establish a voice to Parliament. Just 4 of the 19 closing the gap targets are on track to be met, and many of the fundamental challenges First Nations communities face remain deeply entrenched. Just last week as well, we saw the New South Wales coroner announce that there have been a record number of First Nations deaths in custody so far this year in the state. The coroner, Teresa O'Sullivan, called that a profoundly distressing milestone. And of course, that kind of coincided almost to the day of the referendum failure, which means, there's been a lot of reflection. There is always a lot of reflection at this time of year. But despite the referendum's failure, I wanted to quote Alira Davis from the Uluru Youth Dialogue. She spoke to the AAP last week and said that even though the referendum did fail, it started millions of conversations and changed the landscape of Indigenous affairs in real ways. She said, quote, "People who have never thought about certain parts of Australia's history or about how power is distributed or about who makes decisions for First Nations people are now having these important conversations because of the referendum." I just want to finish on this line that she added, "Change in this country takes time, decades in our case, but history tells us it always begins with persistence."
A powerful quote to end on, a really important story, and like we said, one that we're going to be hearing a lot about this week as it is the anniversary. Thank you so much for explaining.
Thank you, Billi.
And thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Daily Aus. We'll be back this afternoon with your afternoon headlines, but until then, have a great day.